The space station Luminara floated in the dark between three great territories of the galaxy, spinning slowly like a silver coin tossed into the void. It was the only place in the known universe where every species agreed not to kill each other, at least for a few days. Inside its massive assembly hall, representatives from over 40 alien civilizations had gathered for what they called the Centennial Accord, a summit that happened once every 100 years to decide who got what, who owed what, and who would keep their mouths shut about the rest. Yoon Do-han stood near the tall observation window of the human delegation's quarters and watched the stars. He was a man in his mid-50s with gray at his temples and calm, dark eyes that gave away nothing. He had been a military strategist once, a man who planned battles and moved fleets like pieces on a board. Now he wore a diplomat suit instead of a uniform, but the mind underneath had not changed. He still thought in terms of positions, advantages, and escape routes. Behind him, Kang Nari sat at a long table covered in data screens, her fingers moving fast across documents that would have made most people's eyes glaze over in minutes. Nari was younger than Do-han by 15 years, sharp-faced and serious, with the kind of memory that forgot nothing. She had read every treaty the galaxy had ever produced. She could quote clauses from agreements signed before humanity even had electricity. When other diplomats tried to slip tricks into legal language, Nari found them the way a dog finds a bone buried in the yard. The third member of their inner circle was Baek Jin-ho, the head of their security detail. Jin-ho was a quiet man built like a wall, with short-cropped hair and hands that were never quite still. He stood near the door, watching everything and saying almost nothing. He had a soldier's habit of counting exits and measuring distances. He trusted no one on this station, except the two people in this room. The summit had opened that morning with speeches. Do-han had sat through all of them, with a polite smile on his face, clapping at the right moments, nodding when others nodded. The Grand Speaker of the Rathali Dominion, a tall insectoid creature named Torvan, had given the longest speech. He talked about unity and shared purpose, and the bright future of galactic cooperation. His mandibles clicked between sentences in a way that sounded almost musical, but his compound eyes were cold and calculating. Do-han had watched those eyes carefully. They moved too often toward the Caliph delegation across the hall. The Caliph were a reptilian warrior species, scaled and heavy, with a culture built entirely around strength and conquest. Their ambassador, a warlord named Dren, had said very little during the opening ceremony. He sat with his thick arms crossed, his yellow eyes half closed, looking bored. But Do-han noticed that Dren and Torvan never looked at each other directly. That was the tell. When two rivals in a room are careful not to look at each other, it usually means they have already looked at each other plenty in private. The Rathali and the Caliph had been enemies for centuries. They competed for trade routes, fought border skirmishes, and publicly insulted each other at every opportunity. So when both delegations arrived at Luminara, acting strangely polite and coordinated, Do-han felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Humans were still the newcomers here. 80 years in galactic politics was nothing. Some of the species in that assembly hall had been traveling between stars for 10,000 years. They looked at humanity the way an old cat looks at a kitten that wandered into the house, sometimes amused, sometimes annoyed, and always certain that the kitten did not truly belong. But the kitten had grown fast. In 80 years, humanity had built trade networks, developed technology that no other species could quite replicate, and spread across dozens of star systems. They called it Soltech, the adaptive technology born from human creativity and stubbornness. It powered medical systems, navigation arrays, communication networks, and 100 other things the galaxy had quietly become dependent on. And that, Do-han suspected, was exactly the problem. On the second day, The first round of treaty proposals was released to all delegations. It was a thick document, thousands of pages of legal language so dense and tangled that most ambassadors would hand it to their advisors and forget about it until someone told them where to sign. But Do-hwan did not have most advisors. He had Kang Nari. Nari locked herself in her quarters and read for 9 hours straight. She drank 4 cups of black coffee and ate nothing. When she finally came to Do-hwan's room, her face was tight, and her eyes were bright with the kind of anger she only showed in private. She sat down across from him and placed her data screen on the table. She said the treaty looked fair on the surface. It talked about shared resources and mutual benefit and equal partnerships. But buried in the subclauses, hidden behind layers of legal reference and cross-linked amendments, was a cage. The treaty would cap human fleet sizes. It would force humanity to share Soltech designs openly, without fair payment or licensing rights. It would restrict human expansion into new systems by requiring approval from a galactic committee that the Rathali controlled. In short, it would freeze humanity in place while every other major power continued to grow. Do-hwan listened without interrupting. When Nari finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her if she was certain. She told him she had checked 3 times. Do-hwan leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He was not surprised. Disappointed, maybe, in the way a man is disappointed when the rain he expected finally arrives. He had hoped he was wrong about this summit. He had hoped the galaxy had more respect for humanity than this. But hope was not a strategy. He called Jinho into the room and gave him a quiet order. Get the ship ready. Full fuel, full supplies, full crew on standby. Do it quietly. Tell no one outside their delegation. Jinho did not ask why. He simply nodded and left. Later that night, Do-hwan stood at the observation window again. Nari joined him. The stars outside were cold and endless, and somewhere out there, Earth was spinning on, unaware of the trap being laid around its children. Nari asked him what they were going to do. Do-hwan looked at her. His face was calm, almost peaceful. He said, they thought we needed them. He said it was time to find out if they needed us. By the 3rd day of the summit, the Grand Assembly Hall of Luminara had settled into a rhythm. Delegations arrived in the morning, argued until midday, ate lunch in separate corners of the station, and then argued some more until evening. It was diplomacy at its finest, which meant it was slow, exhausting, and full of people smiling while they sharpened their knives behind their backs. Yoon Do-hwan played his part perfectly. He raised small objections during the sessions, not about the big traps hidden in the treaty, but about minor details. A word here, a comma there, a request for clarification on a subclause that no one else had bothered to read. Each objection was polite and reasonable. The other delegations began to shift in their seats, annoyed but unable to complain, because Do-hwan was technically following every rule of procedure. Torvan watched from his elevated seat at the head of the hall, his compound eyes tracking Do-hwan like a predator watching something small move through the grass. The Rathali Grand Speaker was not a patient creature. His species thought in terms of efficiency and control. Every minute wasted was a minute his carefully built plan was not moving forward. He began to press the smaller delegations publicly, calling on them one by one to voice their support for the treaty. The Marathi delegation, a small bird-like species with no military to speak of, agreed immediately. So did the Fenori, a fungal collective that depended entirely on Rathali trade routes for survival. One by one, the minor species fell in line, not because they believed in the treaty, but because they were afraid of what would happen if they did not. Do-hwan watched it happen and said nothing. He kept his face pleasant and his hands folded on the table. Beside him, Nari was doing the same, but her eyes were sharp and busy. She was counting votes, measuring alliances, and waiting for her moment. It came on the afternoon of the third day. The session chairman, a neutral Yemeni official, opened the floor for counter-proposals. Nari stood up. She did not attack the treaty. That was the brilliant part. She did not call it unfair or accuse anyone of plotting against humanity. Instead, she presented a set of amendments so simple and so obviously reasonable that anyone listening with honest ears would have accepted them immediately. She proposed that technology sharing should be mutual, not one-sided. She proposed that fleet limitations should apply equally to all species, not just humans. She proposed that expansion rights should be determined by a transparent council where every species had an equal vote, not a committee controlled by any single power. The chamber went very quiet. Every delegate in the room understood what had just happened. Nari had not fought the treaty. She had held up a mirror to it. If the treaty was truly about fairness and cooperation, as Torvald claimed, then these amendments should be easy to accept. But if the treaty was really about controlling humanity, then accepting these amendments would destroy its entire purpose. Torvald's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation his species could not easily hide. He called for a recess. The hall emptied, and the murmuring began. That evening, Torvald requested a private meeting with Dohan. They met in a small conference room on the upper levels of the station, just the two of them. No aides, no translators. Torvald could speak standard Galactic Common well enough when he wanted to. He did not waste time with pleasantries. His tall body leaned forward, his segmented arms folded on the table, and he spoke plainly. He told Dohan that humanity had expanded too quickly. He said the galaxy had a balance, an order that had existed for thousands of years before humans crawled out of their single little world. He said the treaty was not a punishment. It was a correction. Humanity needed to learn its place. Accept the terms, he said, or your species will find itself very alone. Dohan sat across from him and listened to every word. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not even change his expression. When Torvald finished, Dohan simply nodded once, stood up, and walked out of the room without saying a single word in response. Torvald sat alone in the conference room for several minutes after that, his compound eyes staring at the empty chair across from him. He had expected anger, or fear, or bargaining. The silence unsettled him more than any of those would have. While Dohan was meeting with Torvald, Jinho was doing what Jinho did best. He had spent the last 2 days monitoring communications on the station, using equipment that officially did not exist. That night, he cracked an encrypted channel between the Rithali and Caliph delegations, and found exactly what Dohan had suspected. The two species had signed a secret military pact before the summit even began. If humanity refused the treaty, a combined Rithali-Caliph fleet would move to blockade human trade routes. They would choke humanity slowly, cutting off supplies and allies until the humans had no choice but to crawl back to the table and sign whatever was put in front of them. Jinho brought the decoded messages to Dohan and Nari that night aboard their dock ship. The three of them sat in the secure briefing room, the door locked, the walls shielded against every kind of surveillance known to galactic science. Nari read the messages twice. Her jaw tightened. She asked Dohan what Earth said. Dohan told her he had been in contact with the Human Confederacy leadership for the past 48 hours through a private quantum channel. The decision had already been made. It was not made in anger or in haste. It was made calmly, after careful consideration of every option, every risk, and every consequence. The Confederacy had run the numbers, modeled the scenarios, and reached a conclusion. Nari asked what the conclusion was. Dohan looked at her, then at Jinho. He said tomorrow they would leave, and they would not say what anyone expected them to say. Jinho asked if there would be trouble at the docking clamps. Dohan said no. He said the station would not dare use force against a departing delegation, because that would violate the neutrality that Luminara was built on. And Torvan, for all his scheming, was not stupid enough to destroy the one rule that kept the station from becoming a battlefield. Nari was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if Dovan was sure this was the right thing to do. Not for strategy or politics, but for the people back home who would live with whatever happened next. Dovan said he was not sure. He said certainty was a luxury for people who did not carry responsibility. But he said he would rather take his people into the unknown standing on their feet than keep them safe on their knees. The three of them sat in silence after that. The ship hummed softly around them. Somewhere beyond the hull, the great station of Luminara turned slowly in the dark, and 40 alien civilizations slept peacefully, still believing that tomorrow would go according to their plans. The morning of the fourth day began like any other at the summit. Delegations filed into the Grand Assembly Hall in their usual order. The major powers first, the minor species trailing behind like small fish following sharks. The air recyclers hummed. The translation systems crackled softly as they prepared to convert 40 different languages into something everyone could understand. Seats filled, aides shuffled documents. The ordinary machinery of galactic politics ground forward. Torvan arrived early. He had prepared a speech about galactic unity and shared destiny, the kind of speech designed to sound inspiring while meaning nothing. He expected this to be the day humanity accepted the treaty. Dohan's silence the previous evening had been interpreted by the Rathali delegation as surrender. A species that had nothing left to say, they reasoned, had nothing left to fight with. Dren of the Caliph sat in his usual place, arms crossed, yellow eyes scanning the room with the lazy attention of a predator who had already eaten, but was still watching the herd. He had done his part. The military pact was signed. The fleets were positioned. All that remained was for the humans to bend, and the galaxy could return to its proper shape. Pellis of the Yemni sat quietly in the middle rows, her smooth amphibian skin glistening under the hall's pale lights. She was the only leader in the room who looked worried. She had tried to warn Nari the day before, tried to tell her that compromise was still possible, that the galaxy did not have to go down this path. Nari had thanked her kindly and said nothing else. That nothing else kept Pellis awake all night. Dowan walked at the front, his steps unhurried, his suit crisp, his face carrying the same calm expression he had worn every day since arriving. Nari walked beside him, her data screens nowhere to be seen. Her hands were empty. Behind them came Jinho and the rest of the security detail, and behind them every single member of the human delegation. All of them. Aides, translators, technical staff, cultural attachés. Every human on the station walked into that hall together. A few delegates noticed and exchanged glances. It was unusual for an entire delegation to attend a general session. But the session began, and attention turned to the agenda. The chairman called for final statements before the treaty vote. Torvan was scheduled to speak first, but before he could rise, Dowan raised his hand and asked for the floor. The chairman hesitated. Protocol said major powers spoke in order of seniority, and humanity was the most junior presence at the table. But denying a delegation the right to speak before a vote would be a violation of procedure. And the chairman was Yemni. The Yemni did things properly. He granted Dohan the floor. Dohan stood and walked to the central podium. The hall was large enough to hold 1,000 beings. His footsteps echoed in the silence. He placed no notes on the podium. He activated no data screens. He simply stood there and looked out at the assembled representatives of the known galaxy. When he spoke, his voice was not loud. It carried clearly through the translation systems, calm and steady, the voice of a man who had already made his decision and was no longer afraid of anything in the room. He said that 80 years ago, humanity reached the stars and found that they were not alone. He said that on that day, humans felt something extraordinary: wonder, hope, the belief that the universe was bigger and more beautiful than they had ever imagined, and that the species who lived among the stars would be partners in exploring it. He paused. The hall was perfectly still. Then he said that humanity had come to this summit as partners. They came with open hands and honest intentions. They came ready to share, to cooperate, to build something together. And in return, he said, this is what they found. He began to list facts. He did not raise his voice. He did not point fingers. He simply stated what had happened, one thing after another, like a man reading a report. Humanity proposed fair technology exchange. The treaty demanded one-sided surrender of Soltech intellectual property. Humanity proposed equal fleet regulations. The treaty imposed caps only on human vessels. Humanity proposed transparent governance of expansion rights. The treaty placed control in a committee dominated by the Rathali Dominion. Humanity asked for partnership. The treaty offered a leash. A murmur ran through the hall. Minor species shifted uncomfortably. Torvan's mandibles had gone still, which was worse than when they clicked. Then Dowan did something no one expected. He held up a data chip and said that 3 days ago, his security team intercepted and decoded encrypted communications between the Rathali Dominion and the Caliph Empire. He said these communications revealed a secret military pact signed before the summit began, a pact that committed both powers to blockade human trade routes if humanity refused the treaty. The hall erupted. Delegates shouted. Aides scrambled for their communication devices. Dren's yellow eyes snapped wide open for the first time in days. Torvan rose from his seat, his segmented body rigid with fury. His mandibles clicking so fast, the sound was like breaking glass. He stood at the podium with his hands at his sides and waited until the noise died down. It took a full 2 minutes. When the hall was quiet again, he spoke his final words. He said that the human confederacy came to this table believing it was a place for equals. It was not. It was a cage built with polite words and legal tricks, backed by secret fleets and hidden threats. He said humanity would not sit in a cage. He said the human confederacy formally withdrew from the Centennial Accord and from all standing mutual aid agreements with every signatory, effective immediately. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had ever filled that hall. Dowan stepped away from the podium. Behind him, Kong Nari stood, then Baek Jinho. Then every human in the hall rose together, 43 men and women standing as one body. They turned and walked toward the exit. No one ran. No one looked back. Their footsteps echoed in the enormous chamber, steady and unhurried, and not a single alien in the room said a word to stop them. Pellis watched them go. Her wide amphibian eyes were filled with something between admiration and dread. She understood what the rest of the hall had not yet grasped. This was not a tantrum. This was not a bluff. Humanity had not stormed out in anger. They had walked out in order. There was a difference, and that difference was terrifying. The human delegation reached their ship within 20 minutes. Jinho confirmed all personnel were aboard. Dowan gave the order, and the docking clamps released. The ship pulled away from Luminara in silence. No parting broadcast, no final message. Just a vessel turning its nose toward the dark and accelerating away. Within the hour, reports began flooding into the assembly hall from across the galaxy. Human military vessels were withdrawing from shared patrol routes. Human trade ships were recalling to home ports. Human medical teams stationed on alien worlds were packing their equipment. Human engineers maintaining Soltech systems on foreign stations or uploading final maintenance logs and boarding shuttles home. It was happening everywhere, all at once, in perfect coordination. It was not chaos, it was a plan. Humanity had prepared for this for weeks, maybe longer. Every withdrawal was clean, professional, and complete. They left nothing behind, and they damaged nothing on their way out. They simply stopped being there. Back in the Grand Assembly Hall, Torvan stood frozen at his seat, his prepared speech about unity still loaded on his data screen, undelivered and now meaningless. Around him, the hall buzzed with panic, accusations, and the first cracks of fear. The Yemeni elder voice looked up at the towering Retheli and asked him quietly what they had done. Torvan did not answer for a long time. His compound eyes stared at the empty human seats across the hall. Pellis answered her own question. She said they had woken them up. The first week was quiet. The galaxy held its breath and waited for humanity to come back. Surely they would come back. Surely this was a negotiating tactic, a dramatic gesture designed to win better terms. Every species in the assembly had seen walkouts before. They were theater. You left the room, you let the other side sweat for a day or two, and then you returned with a new list of demands. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. But the days passed, and humanity did not come back. On the fourth day after the withdrawal, the first real problem appeared. The Marathi homeworld, a warm planet orbiting a yellow star in the outer spiral, had been receiving regular shipments of a human-developed medication called Solanex. It was a simple drug by human standards, a treatment for a respiratory disease that affected 12 different species across the galaxy. Human pharmaceutical ships delivered it on a monthly cycle, cheap and reliable, like clockwork. The ships did not come. The Marathi Health Ministry sent urgent messages to the Human Trade Office on their world. The office was empty. The humans had left 2 days earlier, quietly, politely, and completely. Within a week, hospitals on 6 different worlds began rationing Solanex. Doctors who had never worried about supply suddenly found themselves counting pills and choosing which patients would receive treatment and which would wait. On a Fenori colony station, 3 elderly patients died of the respiratory disease for the first time in 40 years. The Fenori Council sent an angry message to the Rethali Dominion, demanding answers. Torvan did not respond. The medical crisis was only the beginning. Soltech was woven into the fabric of galactic civilization more deeply than anyone had realized, or more accurately, than anyone had been willing to admit. Human adaptive systems ran navigation arrays on hundreds of stations. Human software managed agricultural production on colony worlds that could not grow enough food without it. Human communication relays linked species who had no direct contact with each other. All of it had been provided through trade agreements and mutual aid pacts, the same pacts that Dohan had just dissolved. Without human maintenance teams, the systems began to degrade. Navigation errors increased. Agricultural yields dropped. Communication channels developed delays, then gaps, then silence. A Rethali trade station in the mid-rim reported that its docking guidance system had failed, and 2 cargo ships collided in the approach lane. No one died, but the cargo was destroyed, and the station was closed for repairs that no one on board knew how to perform. Because the system was Soltech, and the only people who truly understood Soltech were human. Then the pirates came. For decades, human patrol ships had quietly maintained order in 3 frontier sectors. These were the rough edges of the galaxy, regions where borders were unclear and law was whatever the biggest gun said it was. Pirates, smugglers, and raiders had once thrived there, but humanity's fast, well-armed patrol vessels had beaten them back year after year, until the frontier sectors became almost safe, almost civilized. Other species had noticed the peace and moved in, built stations, opened trade routes, and set up colonies. They enjoyed the safety without ever thinking about who provided it. Now the patrols were gone. Within 10 days, pirate raids tripled. A Caliph mining outpost on the edge of the Vren Expanse sent a distress signal when 3 raider ships attacked. The outpost commander activated the Joint Defense Network and requested immediate support. The automated response came back in a flat mechanical voice. Human vessels no longer operated in this sector. The request was being rerouted to the Caliph home fleet. The home fleet was 3 days away at maximum speed. The outpost fell in 6 hours. Dren received the report in his quarters aboard the Caliph flagship. He read it twice, set it down, and stared at the wall for a long time. He had mocked humanity's military. He had called them soft, said they bled easily, said their ships were fast, but their hearts were weak. Now his own outpost was burning because those soft, fast ships were no longer there to protect it. On Earth and across the human colonies, life continued as normal. The human confederacy had prepared for the withdrawal the way they prepared for everything, thoroughly and without drama. Trade routes were redirected to internal networks. Military assets were pulled back to defensive positions around human space. Supply chains were adjusted. There was disruption, yes, but it was managed disruption, planned and contained. Dowan addressed the Confederacy in a broadcast that was deliberately kept calm and short. He said humanity did not need to punish anyone. He said they only needed to take care of their own people. The galaxy, he said, would teach itself the lesson. Kang Nari was given the task of handling incoming diplomatic messages, and there were many. In the first 2 weeks after the withdrawal, she received over 300 communications from alien governments. Some were angry demands that humanity return to its obligations. Some were thinly veiled threats. Some were desperate, pleading, almost begging for help. Nari read every single one. She filed them in order. She responded to none. Pellis returned to her homeworld and immediately began working to organize a new summit. She contacted every species she trusted, called in every favor she had, and spent sleepless nights drafting proposals for a fair resolution. But without humanity at the table, no one trusted anyone else enough to sit down together. The Rathali blamed the Caliph. The Caliph blamed the Rathali. The minor species blamed both of them. Pellis sent message after message, and received excuses, deflections, and silence in return. Torvon faced a growing crisis at home. The Rathali Dominion's power was built on controlling trade routes, and those routes were drying up. Human cargo ships had carried goods between dozens of species who had no direct transport agreements with each other. Without them, the routes still existed, but nothing moved through them. The Rathali economy, designed to profit from the flow of goods, began to contract. Torvon's political rivals sensed weakness. They began making speeches about failed leadership and broken strategies. Torvon spent his nights pacing his chambers, reading reports of economic decline, and understanding for the first time that the species he had tried to cage was the same species that had been quietly holding his empire's economy together. 3 weeks after the withdrawal, Dren did something no one expected. He sent a private message to Dowan through an unofficial channel. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was a single line of text, written in standard galactic common, with no encryption and no formality. It said you fight without fighting, and that he did not think humanity had it in them. Dowan read the message, smiled very slightly, and did not reply. The weeks turned into months. Small conflicts erupted between species that had previously coexisted peacefully. Supply shortages led to disputes, and disputes led to skirmishes. The galactic order that had held together for centuries, imperfect but functional, was cracking at every seam. And in the middle of all of it, there was a human-shaped hole that no one could fill. Late one night, 2 months after the walkout, Torvon sat alone in his private office aboard the Rathali capital station. On the wall in front of him was a galaxy map, the kind used by military planners, showing every major route, outpost, and territory in known space. He had ordered his aides to highlight every position where humanity had been present before the withdrawal. Trade routes, patrol zones, medical stations, technology hubs, communication relays, agricultural support missions. The highlights covered the map like a web, thin lines connecting every corner of the galaxy, touching every species, reaching into every sector. Humanity had not built an empire. They had built something quieter and far more dangerous. They had made themselves necessary. Torvald stared at the glowing web of human presence and whispered to the empty room that they had been everywhere. 3 months after the walkout, the galaxy looked like a house where someone had pulled out a single brick and watched the walls slowly lean. Nothing had collapsed entirely, not yet, but everything was tilted, unstable, waiting for one more push to bring it all down. Trade was broken. Borders were contested. Pirates roamed sectors that had been safe for decades. And every attempt to fix any of it ran into the same invisible wall, the absence of the one species that had quietly connected everything together. Pellis had not slept properly in weeks. The Yemeni elder voice had tried everything. She had called summits that no one attended. She had proposed compromises that no one accepted. She had begged, reasoned, and argued with every leader she could reach, and all of it had come to nothing. The galaxy was too busy blaming itself to fix itself. So Pellis did the only thing she had left to do. She boarded a ship, alone, without guards or aides or official diplomatic credentials, and she flew to Earth. The journey took 11 days, through routes that were slower than they used to be, because the human relay stations along the way were no longer boosting navigation signals. When her small ship entered the Sol system, it was met by a pair of human patrol vessels that escorted her to the orbital station above Earth, without incident. They were polite. They were professional. They did not ask why she was there. Yoon Do-han and Kang Nari met her in a simple meeting room on the station. There was no grand hall, no elevated seats, no audience, just a plain table, 3 chairs, and a window that looked down at the blue and white curve of humanity's homeworld. Pellis looked tired. Her smooth amphibian skin, usually bright and moist, was dull with exhaustion. She sat down across from Do-han and Nari and folded her webbed hands on the table. She did not make demands. She did not try to negotiate or offer deals or appeal to strategy. She spoke simply and from a place of honest pain. She said the galaxy was hurting. She said she was not there to represent the ones who had wronged humanity. She knew what Torvald and Dren had done, and she had no intention of defending them. She was there because people were dying. Her people, other people's, patients without medicine, colonies without food, stations without power, families caught in crossfire between species that had forgotten how to share a border without someone standing between them. She said she believed humanity still cared about that. Do-han listened. His face gave away nothing, as always. Nari sat beside him, her hands still, her eyes on Pellis. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the station and the distant sound of Earth's oceans visible through the window. Do-han did not answer immediately. He looked at the table for a long time, and in that silence, Pellis felt more fear than she had felt in all her years of diplomacy. Because she understood that Do-han was not deciding whether to help. He had already made that decision long before she arrived. What he was doing was deciding how much to let her see of the weight he carried. He was deciding how honest to be. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. He said humanity had not withdrawn because they wanted the galaxy to suffer. They withdrew because staying would have meant accepting chains. and a species that accepts chains once will wear them forever. He said the 3 months of silence had not been easy for his people either. Human doctors had watched from a distance as patients they used to treat went without medicine. Human engineers had read reports of systems they built failing without maintenance. Human soldiers had monitored pirate attacks on stations they used to protect and had done nothing, not because they did not care, but because the galaxy needed to understand what it had taken for granted. He said the lesson was not cruelty, it was clarity. Then he looked at Nari. She met his eyes and nodded. It was a small gesture, barely visible, but it carried the weight of months of preparation. Dohan told Pellis that humanity would return, but nothing would be the same. There would be no grand multilateral treaty. The Centennial Accord was dead, and humanity had no interest in reviving it. Instead, the Human Confederacy would sign bilateral agreements with individual species, one at a time, face to face, with terms that were clear, fair, and equal. Every agreement would include mutual respect for sovereignty. Every agreement would include fair exchange for technology and resources. Every agreement would include shared defense obligations that went both ways. No cages, no tricks, no hidden clauses. Any species that wanted to work with humanity was welcome to approach the table. Any species that did not was free to walk away. There would be no pressure and no punishment. Only honesty. Pellis was the first to sign. The agreement between the Yemeni Collective and the Human Confederacy was drafted in 2 days and signed on the 3rd. It was 12 pages long. Nari had written it, and every word was plain enough for anyone to understand. There were no subclauses designed to confuse. There were no legal traps buried in footnotes. Pellis read it once, smiled for the first time in months, and signed it without requesting a single change. Word spread quickly. Within a week, 9 minor species had sent delegations to Earth requesting bilateral talks. Humanity received them all with the same quiet professionalism. Dohan oversaw each negotiation personally, and Nari reviewed every document. No 2 agreements were identical because no 2 species had the same needs, but every agreement shared the same foundation of fairness and respect. The Rethali Dominion was not invited. Torvan, who had ruled the Dominion for 30 years through cunning and control, found himself facing a council that no longer feared him. His secret pact with the Caliph had been exposed to the entire galaxy. His economic strategy had failed. His trade routes were empty. His rivals on the council moved against him with the kind of coordinated efficiency he himself had once been famous for. Within 6 weeks of humanity's return, Torvan was quietly removed from power. No violence, no trial, just a vote in a closed chamber, and a door that locked behind him. He spent the rest of his days on a minor Rethali colony, watching cargo ships pass overhead that no longer carried his authority. Dren of the Kalis surprised everyone. He was the second leader, after Pellis, to request a bilateral agreement with humanity. He came to Earth personally, which was almost unheard of for a Caliph warlord. His species believed that traveling to someone else's territory for negotiations was a sign of submission. Dren did not care. He walked into the meeting room where Dohan waited, looked around at the simple furniture and the view of Earth through the window, and sat down without ceremony. The negotiation took 4 days. Dren argued hard on military terms because that was his nature, but he argued fairly, and when the final document was ready, he signed it with his own hand. At the signing, he reached across the table and clasped Dohan's hand in the Caliph grip, a gesture reserved for warriors who had earned respect in battle. His yellow eyes met Dowan's dark ones, and he said simply that Dowan had earned this. Nari spent the following months building something new. She called it the Sol Accords, not a single treaty, but a framework, a set of principles that any species could adopt when making agreements with any other species. It was open, transparent, and designed specifically so that no single power could ever again use legal tricks to cage another. She published it freely. She invited every species to use it, modify it, and improve it. Within a year, it had become the foundation of more interstellar agreements than the old Centennial Accord had produced in a century. Jinho, who had never wanted to be anything other than a soldier, quietly returned to the frontier sectors. Human patrol ships resumed operations alongside Allied vessels. Piracy dropped by 70% within the first month. Jinho never gave speeches or attended ceremonies. He simply did his job, the same way he always had, and the frontier became safe again. On the day of the first Soul Accord summit, held at Earth's orbital station, Do-Wan stood at the observation window and watched ships arrive. Rathali vessels flew beside Yemni transports. Kalith warships docked next to Marathi trading boats. Human ships moved among all of them, steady and familiar, like a heartbeat the galaxy had learned to recognize. Nari found him there. She stood beside him and watched the lights of arriving ships against the black canvas of space. She asked him if he thought it would last this time. Do-Wan smiled. It was a real smile, small and tired, but warm. He said it did not need to last forever. It just needed to be honest. They stood together in silence as the galaxy came to their door, not because it had to, but because it chose to. Outside the window, the stars burned on as they always had, cold and endless, and indifferent to the small warm creatures who sailed between them. But those creatures had learned something. They had learned that the ones who hold the door open do not always need to be the strongest. Sometimes they only need to be the ones willing to close it. And when they do, the galaxy remembers what darkness feels like.